Good morning, everyone. I'm Mary. So we're going to start in 1954 with the Geneva Accords of 1954. They were signed in July and supervised by the International Control Commission. They aimed to establish peace in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. These agreements created a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, banned foreign bases in Vietnam, and called for elections within 2 years to unify the country. Concern over communist leader Ho Chi Minh's potential election victory fueled U.S. fears of communism spreading in Southeast Asia. Fast forward to 1964, to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On August 2nd, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the USS Maddox. Additional attacks were reported 2 days later, but those were later proven false. President Johnson responded with bombing campaigns, and on August 7th, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting broad military authority, and that was later appealed. In the late 1960s, the Vietnamization policy, which was initiated by President Nixon, sought to reduce U.S. involvement by gradually withdrawing troops and transferring combat responsibilities to South Vietnamese forces. By the early 1970s, tens of thousands of U.S. troops had left Vietnam. In 1968, on January 31st, the Tet Offensive occurred. It was a turning point. This coordinated attack involved 85,000 North Vietnamese troops targeting cities and bases across South Vietnam. While North Vietnam was defeated, the offensive caused widespread destruction, heavy casualties, and displaced 650,000 people. In May 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced the start of peace talks with North Vietnam, which was a critical step toward the signing of the Vietnam Peace Accords. And now we're going to have a short video on that.
But one of the most important electronic contacts between Orient and Occident came in the early hours of May 3rd.
The government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam is of the view that the former talks between Hanoi and Washington should be held immediately. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam welcomes the French government's willingness to offer Paris as a site for the talks between Hanoi's representatives and the United States.
The signals of Radio Hanoi broadcasting a note of hope. The North Vietnamese government at last was ready to enter into formal talks about the prospects of peace. At the White House, President Johnson worked through the pre-dawn hours that Friday in order to deliver his carefully phrased response.
I was informed about 1 o'clock this morning that Hanoi was prepared to meet in Paris on May the 10th or several days thereafter. After conferring with Secretary of State and Defense and Ambassador Goldberg and Ball and Secretary Harriman and Mr. Vance, I have sent a message informing Hanoi that the date of May the 10th and the site of Paris are acceptable to the United States.
The diplomatic deadlock over a site for the peace talks was finally broken. The North Vietnamese had revealed a willingness to talk, but only on their terms and at places where all the advantages would be theirs, such as Warsaw, Phnom Penh, or Burma. But the president, who had already offered at least 15 locations, had stood firm for a conference site that would be acceptable to both sides. And the American negotiators Averell Harriman and Cyrus Vance would face a communist delegation headed by Xuan Thuy in the French capital. But the war did not end with the start of talks at the Avenue Kléber. Clark Clifford, Secretary of Defense, CIA Director Richard Helms, General McConnell from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Walt Rostow, the President's Special Assistant, these were some of the security advisors who worked with the President in meeting the enemy's newest combat challenge, Red for Blood in May. It was Hanoi's jungle password, a promise of new bloodshed and terror. It was a communist version of the old Prussian dictum of von Clausewitz: war is a continuation of diplomacy by other means. During May, American special detection equipment, including starlight scopes, revealed that record numbers of North Vietnamese soldiers were infiltrating into South Vietnam. 30,000 communist troops a month on their way south to celebrate the 78th birthday of Ho Chi Minh by launching rocket and terror attacks on such cities as Pleiku, Can Tho, Da Nang, Saigon, and other southern cities. 4 more weeks of death and destruction to innocent civilians and over 100,000 new refugees. The communists paid dearly for their desperation tactics, losing almost 5,000 men a week. For the Allies, it was also costly, especially the Americans, who lost 562 men one week, 549 the next. May was the bloodiest month of the war. And although the Paris talks held a faint promise of peace, the president grieved over the fact that by Memorial Day 1968, over 20,000 Americans and 23 times that many Vietnamese soldiers had fallen in these 3 years of struggle along the frontiers of freedom.
The battlefield is the scarred and the lonely landscape of man's greatest failure. But it is a place where heroes walk. There will come a day when the last American soldier will have stacked arms in Vietnam.
August 4th, 1969, negotiations began and ended December 20th, 1973, consisting of 68 meetings. President Nixon was 3 days into his second term when he makes the announcement that it was a day after President Lyndon B. Johnson passed away. Richard Nixon's announcement, made on January 23rd, 1973, regarding the Vietnam Peace Accords.
Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia. The following statement is being issued at this moment in Washington and Hanoi. At 12:30 Paris time today, January 23, 1973, the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was initialed by Dr. Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States and Special Advisor Lee Duc Tho on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The agreement will be formally signed by the parties participating in the Paris Conference on Vietnam on January 27, 1973, at the International Conference Center in Paris. The ceasefire will take effect at 2400 Greenwich Mean Time, January 27, 1973. The United States and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam express the hope that this agreement will ensure stable peace in Vietnam and contribute to the preservation of lasting peace in Indochina and Southeast Asia. That concludes the formal statement. Throughout the years of negotiations, we have insisted on peace with honor. In my addresses to the nation from this room of January 25th and May 8th, I set forth the goals that we considered essential for peace with honor. In the settlement that has now been agreed to, all the conditions that I laid down then have been met. A ceasefire, internationally supervised, will begin at 7 p.m. this Saturday, January 27, Washington time. Within 60 days from this Saturday, all Americans held prisoners of war throughout Indochina will be released. There will be the fullest possible accounting for all of those who are missing in action. During the same 60-day period, all American forces will be withdrawn from South Vietnam. The people of South Vietnam have been guaranteed the right to determine their own future without outside interference. By joint agreement, the full text of the agreement and the protocols to carry it out will be issued tomorrow. Throughout these negotiations, we have been in the closest consultation with President Thieu and other representatives of the Republic of Vietnam. This settlement meets the goals and has the full support of President Thieu and the government of the Republic of Vietnam, as well as that of our other allies who are affected. The United States will continue to recognize the government of the Republic of Vietnam as the sole legitimate government of South Vietnam. We shall continue to aid South Vietnam within the terms of the agreement, and we shall support efforts by the people of South Vietnam to settle their problems peacefully among themselves. We must recognize that ending the war is only the first step toward building the peace. All parties must now see to it that this is a peace that lasts and also a peace that heals. And a peace that not only ends the war in Southeast Asia, but contributes to the prospects of peace in the whole world. This will mean that the terms of the agreement must be scrupulously adhered to. We shall do everything the agreement requires of us, and we shall expect the other parties to do everything it requires of them. We shall also expect other interested nations to help ensure that the agreement is carried out and peace is maintained. As this long and very difficult war ends, I would like to address a few special words to each of those who have been parties in the conflict. First, to the people and government of South Vietnam. By your courage, by your sacrifice, you have won the precious right to determine your own future. And you have developed the strength to defend that right. We look forward to working with you in the future, friends in peace, as we have been allies in war. To the leaders of North Vietnam, as we have ended the war through negotiations, let us now build a peace of reconciliation. For our part, we are prepared to make a major effort to help achieve that goal. But just as reciprocity was needed to end the war, so too will it be needed to build and strengthen the peace. To the other major powers that have been involved, even indirectly, now is the time for mutual restraint, so that the peace we have achieved can last. And finally, to all of you who are listening, the American people, your steadfastness in supporting our insistence on peace with honor has made peace with honor possible. I know that you would not have wanted that peace jeopardized. With our secret negotiations at the sensitive stage they were in during this recent period, for me to have discussed publicly our efforts to secure peace would not only have violated our understanding with North Vietnam, it would have seriously harmed and possibly destroyed the chances for peace. Therefore, I know that you now can understand why, during these past several weeks, I have not made any public statements about those efforts. The important thing was not to talk about peace, but to get peace, and to get the right kind of peace. This we have done. Now that we have achieved an honorable agreement, let us be proud that America did not settle for a peace that would have betrayed our allies, that would have abandoned our prisoners of war, or that would have ended the war for us but would have continued the war for the 50 million people of Indochina. Let us be proud of the 2.5 million young Americans who served in Vietnam, who served with honor and distinction in one of the most selfless enterprises in the history of nations. And let us be proud of those who sacrificed, who gave their lives, so that the people of South Vietnam might live in freedom, and so that the world might live in peace. In particular, I would like to say a word to some of the bravest people I have ever met. The wives, the children, the families of our prisoners of war and the missing in action. When others called on us to settle on any terms, you had the courage to stand for the right kind of peace, so that those who died and those who suffered would not have died and suffered in vain, and so that where this generation knew war, the next generation would know peace. Nothing means more to me at this moment than the fact that your long vigil is coming to an end. Just yesterday, a great American who once occupied this office died. In his life, President Johnson endured the vilification of those who sought to portray him as a man of war. But there was nothing he cared about more deeply than achieving a lasting peace in the world. I remember the last time I talked with him. It was just the day after New Year's. He spoke then of his concern with bringing peace, with making it the right kind of peace. And I was grateful that he once again expressed his support for my efforts to gain such a peace. No one would have welcomed this peace more than he. And I know he would join me in asking for those who died and for those who live. Let us consecrate this moment by resolving together to make the peace we have achieved a peace that will last. Thank you, and good evening.
The Vietnam Peace Accords, also known as the Paris Peace Accords, were signed on January 27, 1973 in Paris, France, marking the official end of direct U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. The agreement was signed by representatives from the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Provisionary Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam, which represented the South Vietnamese Communists.
The day began here in Paris, cold, wet, and gloomy. Around the now famous Majestic Hotel, an impressive security force. It was here that for almost 5 years there were negotiations that seemed frustrating and never got anywhere. Now it's the site where the signing ceremonies took place. There were actually 2 separate ceremonies. The first was this morning among the 4 foreign ministers in a ceremony that was designed to get the 2 forces in South Vietnam to accept the ceasefire without having to accept each other. South Vietnamese Foreign Minister Lum was the first to arrive, followed almost immediately by the Provisional Revolutionary Government's Foreign Minister, Madame Binh. As usual, she was wearing traditional áo dài, the Vietnamese national dress. After her came the Foreign Minister of North Vietnam, Nguyen Duy Trinh. He had arrived 2 days ago from Hanoi for the signing ceremony. The last of the dignitaries to get to the Majestic Hotel was Secretary of State Rogers. His car had driven by hundreds of demonstrators outside. They were carrying North Vietnamese and Viet Cong flags, and they jeered when Mr. Rogers went by. However, it did not seem to bother him, and he waved cheerfully as he walked between the ranks of a French honor guard into the building. Inside, the round table was set and waiting. Mr. Rogers moved to his place, flanked by his aides, including Ambassador William Porter and Ambassador William Sullivan. At just 6 minutes after 11 a.m. local time, the signing began. Each of the men had to place his signature on the documents 32 times. Secretary Rogers seemed to have a little trouble finding a pen that would write, but he finally succeeded. And with that scratch of a pen, the American involvement in Vietnam was over, and America's longest war was ended. What was being signed was the agreement itself calling for an end to the fighting, and 3 protocols dealing with an international control commission, a joint military commission, and the return of prisoners of war. The document itself does not mention any of the signatory countries by name. It just refers to the parties participating in the Paris Conference on Vietnam. It was the formula to avoid having the South Vietnamese and the Provisional Revolutionary Government recognize each other. Foreign Minister Lum of South Vietnam has already said that Saigon is ready to talk to the Viet Cong, but there is no indication on either side that they're willing to make the kind of concessions that will solve the political problems that still exist and which have not been resolved by this agreement. The copies of the agreement were passed around the table, and it was understandable that there was a slight mix-up, and the books had to be repassed so all was correct and according to protocol. The South Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, by the way, refused to even sign on the same page. They used different pages. Aside from that, the ceremony went smoothly and almost matter-of-factly. There were no statements made. Everyone seemed aware of the importance of the moment, and the mood was almost solemn. The foreign ministers, their aides, and invited guests waited quietly as the final signatures were placed on the documents, and then, just 20 minutes after it had begun, the ceremony was over. The delegations rose and slowly moved out of the conference room, the same place they had spent almost 5 years trying to hammer out the agreement they had just signed. A small champagne reception was scheduled in an anteroom, where it's reported the delegations relaxed a bit. Secretary Rogers and Hanoi's Foreign Minister Trinh are reported to have toasted each other, but there's no indication Madam Dinh and Foreign Minister Lum went through the same diplomatic niceties. And that's how the first ceremony went, Sam.
Now that the Vietnam Peace Accords have been signed, this will lead to the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam. The results were to be immediate ceasefire, withdrawal of U.S. and other military troops within 60 days, dismantling of military bases and destructions of any mines in the waters. It would also return of U.S. civilian and military POWs within 60 days, and it would also assist each other with information pertaining to any MIA military or foreign civilians, to include determination of their location and the care of the graves of the deceased until repatriation of the remains. North and South Vietnamese armies had to hold their positions. But not until 1975 did the fall of Saigon to North Vietnamese forces effectively end the war. Lives lost in Vietnam. There are a total of 1.35 million lives lost. U.S. and Allied military deaths, 282,000. Civilian deaths, both of North and South Vietnam, 405,000, 627,000. People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong, military deaths, 444,000, 666,000. Current status of unaccounted for American loss in the Vietnam War, original missing 1,973. As of now, repatriated and identified 729, and remaining missing 1,241. Thank you for joining us today. We have food in our area, and if anybody has any questions, comments, or concerns, now's the time.
All right.
Great job.
Thank you.